To get started on this exercise, download the Scumbling Techniques Photoshop file from the Moodle page and launch it and open it up into Photoshop. This will create a document that's the exact size and resolution that we need. And if you look in your layers panel, you can see it's already got a variety of pre-made groups and layers that we'll work through for this exercise. Within this exercise, we're going to learn a different way of blending together colors and creating a little bit more of a painterly texture. In the past, we've blended colors by essentially just changing up the opacity. For this one, we're going to do what's called scumbling as a scumbling technique. So let's jump in and show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to give myself, for now, just a blank layer to show you how this would work. If I was to use a traditional general soft edge brush, I'll make mine a little bit larger so we can see it. There we go. And if I was to give myself one color, say gold, and then to swap over to, let's do a blue for that one so we can see it. So if I wanted to blend together this blue color, I could start off with that and then blend together the gold color. One way I could do it is by lowering the opacity as I blend from one to the other. So if I did that, I could then swap back over to blue. If you look up on my opacity and drop it down to say 10%, then all I have to do in order to blend from one to the other is build up that opacity until it's completely blended together from one color to the next. And that works out really, really well, and that gives a good soft gradation between those two particular colors. Scumbling, on the other hand, allows me to still blend together two colors, but it does so in more painterly and textured way. It allows your eye to do much more of the blending instead of actually having the colors blended together. So if I was to do this, for instance, with a textured brush, it would look something a little bit more like this. So let's say I lay down some blue on one side, some orange on another, and then I can work back and forth between the orange and the blue. And you can see how even though they're overlapping one another and they're not, quote, blending together to give me more of a greenish color, my eye is blending both of those colors together. And this is the essence of having a scumbled technique. Scumbling is really often more used in painting, like in acrylics and in oil. And so this is kind of simulating that ability within a digital media. So I'm going to delete this away. There are three different tools that we're going to practice doing this technique, and each of the tool has some things to keep in mind as you use them. There's a textured brush, there's a mixture brush, and there's also the smudge tool. All three of these give essentially the same effect, but there's some pros and cons when working between any of those three tools. Very often you'll find yourself using one more often than the other. There really is no advantage other than depending on what you need to do with it. I find myself using all three of these at some point in time in my own personal artwork. Let's start off with a textured brush. For the textured brush, let's go down to our layers panel and open up the textured brush set or groups of layers. Notice that you've got three different layers. I've given you a practice layer, and then I've also given you a clipping mask layer that clips inside of the corresponding circle. What I want you to do is to click on the practice layer first, and we're going to practice scumbling and blending together multiple different colors. For this one, grab up your regular paintbrush tool, and then go up to your paintbrushes and find some sort of textured brush. You can see I was using this one earlier. You can use some of the predefined texture brushes, or you can try some of the media brushes that we created from the previous exercises. Any one of these should work, as long as it gives you a nice kind of scattered, textured feel. We wouldn't want to choose a brush that doesn't have a scattering effect, or we certainly want to use one of these hard edge or soft edge brushes. I really want to give you something that has a lot more random texture to it. I'm going to choose this Kyle's Chunky Bonus charcoal one. With this one, the next thing we need to do is to load up two colors. In my case, I'm going to keep my orange and my blue, but maybe I'm going to swap over the background color for this blue to be a little bit of a darker blue. This way I can blend and have one of them be more of a darker color. Another good key tip and trick to do is if I hit my X key, notice that I can swap between my foreground and background colors. And this makes it much easier to swap between those two colors. So if you see me changing up two different colors, that's what I'm doing. I'm hitting the X key on my keyboard, to swap between those two. Let's practice it up here at the top. I've got my brush nice and large so that when I paint, it gives me that kind of feel. Remember, if we want to add a lot more randomness to this, we can adjust the flow and even the opacity of it. I'm going to bring my flow down just a little bit more so I can see it much, much better. That way it gives me a lot more texture based on the pressure that I have. So with that, I'm going to lay down one textured color. I'm going to hit the X key and swap over to my second color, and then I want to be able to blend another color on top of that. Now the key word here is blending. I don't want it to look like it quickly goes from one color to the next. I really want to have a good gradation. So if I find myself going too fast in my blend, maybe I want to hit X and swap up my foreground and background again, and then hit it again. Maybe I'll even drop down either the opacity or let's bring down the flow much, much more so that I can add or bring up a little bit more of the texture. The main thing is you're getting a feel for blending together one color to the next, and it's letting your eye actually generate that particular blend. This is what I'm looking for. You've got a solid patch of one color, an intermingled patch, and then you've got a darker patch right here. And we've done this using a textured style brush. If you wanted to, you could even play around with more colors. Let's say I wanted to bring in kind of a lighter green and start to blend that and scumble that into here. This is the essence of scumbling. You're taking colors and you're letting your eye mix them. My opacity really should be staying close to 100% in order to see the full texture and to see the full-on color that I'm working with. So once you're done practicing and getting an idea for that, let's go back to our layers panel. And this time I want you to choose the paint with the texture brush that's clipped inside of the circle. With this one, I want you to give me a sphere texture inside of here. So with the sphere, it's got a highlight area and it's gradually getting darker. In order to do this, you can choose any two colors that you want, or if you feel comfortable working in black and white, you can certainly do that. But I'm going to start off with, say, this lighter orange, or excuse me, lighter green is going to be my lightest color. I'll paint it on there. If I wanted to, I could maybe pick a lighter green and we'll scumble on a little bit of that for the highlight. But as it gets darker, maybe it's going to turn more into a bluish kind of color. So I'm going to add that color into this particular base. It's good to start off with a base color. You really don't want to see any white underneath it, although that could add a painterly texture. Now you can see how I've got way too quick of a transition here. So I'm just doing this to paint it in. Swap back over to the green. Maybe I'll pick up some of that original color that's right here. And then I'm just going to scumble this in until it starts to blend in with that one. Maybe I'll pick up some lighter green. I'll start to scumble that in. Let's pick up a little bit more option. And if I wanted the blues to even be a little bit darker, maybe I'll hold down my option key, pick up that blue, and we'll go on full on black. And there we have more of a scumbled texture with that. Let's see if we can blend between this lighter green and the darker green. I can hold down option and click on the darker green and very, very lightly scumble that texture in. Or I can go into my color and pick up some lighter by itself. Oops. And start to paint a little bit more from there. So that's the action of scumbling. And I want you to use just a textured brush to give yourself that kind of painterly feel as you blend together multiple colors. You don't necessarily have to be stuck with just two colors. You can go from a white to a lighter version of a color to a darker version all the way to black at the very, very end. But you're using a textured brush to create that kind of. Now the second way that we could blend together two different colors in a scumbled method is to use our mixer brush tool. The mixer brush is usually hiding underneath your regular brush tool. It looks like a brush tool except for it's got a little paint droplet as part of its icon. And this is kind of a fun tool to use, but it does take a little bit of practice to work with. Right now, I'm going to start off with my regular brush tool so that we can just put down some colors to practice with. Also, let's go back down to our layers panel. I'm going to close out my textured brush group and open up my mixer brush group. As with the other one, I've got a practice area, and then once we're cool with that, then we can jump into our clipping mask area to create a sphere. So with practice, under the mixer brush tool layer selected, let's lay down two different colors. In my case, I'm going to do a light blue on one side, and let's say I wanted to mix this together with a darker, let's go kind of a medium orange. Let's give something we can look at. Let's do a red. Much better, so a darker red. Since these two are side by side, I want to be able to mix them together in a more natural feel. Now, the mixer brush tool is a new brush to Photoshop, and it was created because so many people wanted to do paintings in Photoshop, but they wanted to have a more natural painting style rather than doing the scumbling technique that we did with a textured brush. So with this brush, let's go to our brushes panel, choose the mixer brush tool. You'll notice that you got a large variety of different controls on your control panel. The first thing to know is that there's two things you can do with colors. Traditionally, you can have it work just as a basic blending brush. And so I'm going to keep this one unchecked, so there should be nothing showing up here. And I'm going to keep this one checked on. This means it's going to give me a very clean brush. The main thing I want to play around with are some of these presets. If you've ever worked in oils or acrylics, you know that your paint that you're painting with can either be very, very dry or very, very wet. And the wetter it is, the more easily it can smear and blend. But if you have a drier media, then it'll still blend. It just takes a little bit more of a working to get it done. And in Photoshop, you can blend this or have control all between it. If I was to choose from one extreme, I'm going to do very wet, heavy mix. With my brush tool now, whenever I paint over this area, it's going to blend together those two colors. And since I'm using a nice textured brush, it's automatically scumbling it for me. And you can see that it's more than just scumbling the color on top of it. It is actually smudging it in and blending those two colors together to give me the mixture between those two. And so this is a great natural way of painting because it gives you such a natural kind of blend. Another thing to pay attention to is you can control exactly how wet your media is and how much it's picking up and how much it's mixing together. If I was to make it less wet, so we'll bring it all the way down to more of a dry media. Now when I click and drag, you can see it's not really blending it so much. It's not picking it up and moving it together, and I'd have to work it much, much harder to get it to blend. Load simply means how much is going to be picked up if I was using those brushes, and mix is how much is mixing together. In my case, it's getting 100% of both and then mixing between those two. For me, I tend to keep the mixer brush on a more wet setting, therefore it picks up a lot more of the colors, and then I just play around with the flow to see how much I want it to actually blend together. One thing to pay attention to is whether you're sampling all layers or not. Now this one has kind of a fun thing. If I sample all layers, this is going to look for the colors that's not only on the layer we have selected, but everything else that's below it and on top of it. So for instance, right now I've got this gray as a background texture. If I started clicking and dragging, you can see now it's actually picking up some of that gray and placing it inside of the texture that I have on this layer. Even if I go to this layer, I'm not actually working on it. Well, since it's on top, yeah, there we go. You can see how it's starting to pick up a little bit of the blue from that layer and starting to add it actually into my layer. Now it's actually not affecting any layers that's below it. It's still only working on this practice layer. By default, I usually keep this one unchecked, but later on we'll talk a little bit about some times that you may want to actually sample all of the layers. For now, I'm just going to keep sample all layers unchecked. So to paint our sphere, let's go back down to our layers panel, choose the clipping mask layer that's on top of the central circle, and let's load up two different colors for now. Remember, you can do multiple colors if you want to, but we're going to start off with this one. Instead of starting with the mixer brush tool, I'm going to choose my regular brush tool. I'm going to add down my basic layer to start off with. And then I'm going to choose a darker color. In my case, let's do a dark green to blend this into. Now if I wanted to, I could do some more transitional colors in between here. Let's say I wanted to go from darker green to more of a lighter green, and then let's transition it into yellow. And maybe even this yellow will have a highlight in itself right there. It looks like a good textured scumble for this, but we'll go back over to our toolbox, choose your mixer brush tool. In my case, we're going to make sure that load is turned off and we're also turned on to clean our brush each time. I'm going to keep my wetness settings pretty high. If anything, I'm going to keep it very wet with a heavy mix. And then I can go through here and blend in between those two. This will take a little bit of practice just to get it right, but you can see as you blend between and blend over those two, it'll pick up on whatever color that you start off with. One kind of technique that you can play around with is by going in small circles. That's one quick and easy way of blending together those. Or you can do more direct lines going in a specific direction. In my case, I can go from the central point outward, or I can do little circles to blend those in as well. You can see how this gives you a very, very nice textured kind of style and look as well. Again, if you need to, you can always go back, swap back over to your regular brush tool, grab up whatever color you need. In my case, let's do a little bit more of a lighter, lighter white. Place it on there. Then we'll go back in, pick our mixer brush tool, and let's blend together and mix those in. I don't want to have a perfect blend. Again, we always want to have this little bit of a textured scumble. That's the whole purpose of this particular technique. But that's using the mixer brush tool to give you that kind of quick look and style. The final way you can blend together two different colors is by using the Smudge Tool. As with the other tools, we're going to start off with two different colors. I'm going to go down to my layers panel this time, open up the Smudge Tool group, choose the practice layer, and I'm going to paint one color on one side, and let's get us another bright color. Let's do yellow off on the other. And we want to be able to blend these two colors together or more if we have those. Now the Smudge Tool is not like a regular paintbrush tool. You can find it a little bit lower. It's usually hiding underneath the blur or the sharpen tool. It looks like a little finger, and as the name would suggest, it allows you to smudge and move things around. If we go to the top, you can see you've got a lot of the same kind of controls under your control panel. You can pick out different brushes and you can work in different modes, and you also have a strength to it. I'm going to choose just a regular round brush for now, and I'm going to set my strength a little bit lower. The basic use for the Smudge Tool is that you can click on any area and you can smudge it. You can kind of blur it in one particular direction. Now this kind of comes in handy if you're just using it for simple things and you want to move areas around, but it's not very good by itself in blending colors. As you can see, just with the basic brush, all it's really doing is just pushing it around. The real advantage comes when you start using your textured brushes and your scatter brushes. First off, if we increase the strength, if I go up to 100%, or let's back it off a little bit, the more strength it has, the more you can push it around. And so you can see at 80%, I can do a lot of almost finger painting with it. As a matter of fact, one of the options to choose is finger painting. But if I choose a brush that has a lot more scattering to it, like I'm going to go down to my rake brush that I have here. If you looked at these brush options, you can see that under scattering, how it scatters along the line, and it's even, it's got some angle and size jitter to it, and the spacing is spaced out. With this type of brush, this will add a lot more randomness to the movement that it is, and it gives you a blend that looks more like this. And this is great for blending together two different areas because it adds a little bit of randomness and blend to the area that we're working with. And so you can see how very quickly, in just a couple of clicks, you can add a lot more smudginess and blend to the two different colors. Now when working with this, you need to pay attention to where you start. So whatever color you have, if you want to have more yellow, you can start there and gradually move into it. and then it will gradually blend into the other one. To be honest, I love using the smudge tool a little bit more than the mixer brush tool, simply because it gives me a little bit more control. The other advantage to it is that I can use a variety of different brushes, and they tend to work exactly as I would expect a normal paintbrush to work, and it gives you this fun, fancy effect. The downside to it is you can see it doesn't have as much of a painterly effect. It really is blending those together in a much more graduated sense versus this technique that uses the mixer brush that gives a little bit more texture to it. But it's a great quick fix to work with this one. So once you've played around with this, make sure you're finding a good scattered kind of brush that will give you some good randomness to it. And then let's jump into our clipping mask layer on top of our final circle. We're going to lay down two different colors, so grab your paintbrush tool. I'll start off with my yellow again, adding one particular color on top. Then we'll swap over to let's do a darker blue this time. Adding the darker blue down here. We'll let that be our darkest darks, and maybe a little bit of a lighter greenish blue transitioning between those two, just to add some more to that. I'll even add some white on top of my yellow. So with those, I can now grab my smudge brush tool. The other advantage of using smudge is if for whatever reason you don't have your palette or your painting brush, your tablet with you, you can easily use your mouse and get similar results. As a matter of fact, I can use my mouse right now and blend those together quite nicely, very quickly. Changing the size of your brush will also change the amount of area that you're working with, so do pay attention to how much is being blended and how quickly it blends. But that gives you that kind of look and feel, and it gives even some direction. So you can either go in little circles like I was going, or you can go in straight lines if you want to push or direct your color one way or the other. All right, with that, now we have 3 different methods for creating a scumbled style of blending and gradiating colors. You can use a textured brush to let your eye blend it, or you can use the mixer brush to lay down 2 color fields and mix them together, or you can use your smudge tool to lay down multiple different colors and blend and mix those together as well. Once you're finished with this particular exercise, go ahead and close up all of the different grouped layers, save up this particular Photoshop file, and this Photoshop file is what you're going to upload to Moodle once you're finished.